Right, okay, so it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Roger Luckhurst. He's written for the Financial Times, for the Guardian, and for the London Review of Books. He's a regular contributor for the BBC. And he's also the Geoffrey Tillotson Chair of 19th Century Studies at Birkbeck, University of London. And we're here really to hear Roger talk about his new book, Graveyards, A History of Living with the Dead, which discusses why, how and where we inter our dead. Roger poses the question of how people throughout history have responded to the problem of laying their dead to rest, and gives us a tour of the rich and unusual visual culture of the grave, from the pyramids of Giza to the catacombs of Rome and the cenotaphs erected to the world's war dead. So his most recent book, Graveyards, is going to be central to our conversation here today. Very much look forward to hearing from Roger. Thank you very much.
Well, welcome you curiously morbid and weird people who want to do this on a Sunday lunchtime. Delighted you're all here. And I am here to talk about this book, which came out last October, and with a cover design that was chosen secretly by my partner because she was very amused. It says, "A History of Living with the Dead, Roger Luckhurst." I hadn't noticed that until it was published. Yeah, and I'm going to talk about just a little bit about the book itself, and then I'm going to get really, really detailed, because the thing I think I most enjoy about giving these talks around the country is just cemetery history is such a local history. It's so kind of embedded in a place, and particularly somewhere like York, where you've got these, centuries and centuries of history. It's a really kind of striking thing. So I'm going to try and invite you in to talk about that a little bit. When I gave a talk up in St Andrews recently, just to be very local, I gave them a slide of my favourite grave, I think, in this country, which is of the cholera stone. I don't know if you know this, in the village of Nig, up near Aberdeen, where cholera in 1832 arrived while they were burying someone in the graveyard. So they caught cholera in a bag and they put it under this giant stone. So no one caught cholera in Nig. And then at the end of that, someone came up and just said, that image that you showed of a man pointing at a stone was actually, I'm a direct ancestor of that guy. So it's kind of, we always get the kind of these wonderful kind of local details. So the task I was set by my editor at Thames and Hudson was, can you do burial across all of time and across the globe? And can you do that in no more than 52,000 words, please? So that's the task he set me. This is kind of the structure that we came up with in the end. So I wanted to do stuff on really just the beginnings of burial, because it's such a huge and interesting kind of debate. To try and cut across faiths. One of the reasons I wanted to do the book was just travelling around the world. You want to kind of know how to behave sometimes if you're kind of visiting graveyards. If you're gruesome and are a former goth, then you kind of want to know how to behave. So looking at kind of different faiths, the three main Abrahamic religions, but also I do a bit on Buddhism and Hinduism. And then the third part, which I'm mainly going to focus on, is the modern problem, which is like, what do you do with so many dead bodies? And that's the bit where I'm going to get very specific about just my part of London where I live, because it has such a kind of striking history to it, but also just a sort of invitation also, can we do this for York as well? I'm sure we can. Very intimidating talking in front of Julie, because she's such an expert in this area. So we'll field questions hopefully together, because that will be really great, I think. Okay, so across time, wanting to start early, I didn't realise I was going back 3.2 million years, but there is a really interesting debate amongst paleoarchaeologists and people about whether it's really important for humanity to, it seems, to kind of argue that Homo sapiens, us, were the first kind of beings to do what's called intentional deposition. So, depositing kind of bodies. And the real alarm through the 19th and into the 20th century was beginning to realise that maybe we're not the only kind of species that does this. And there's been lots and lots of investigation of ancient remains. I was very comforted by Ben, my editor, who works on archaeology as well, saying, don't worry, archaeologists largely make it up. You look in the papers and you go, oh, it's an extra 500,000 years has just been added to prehistory. I didn't notice that. So there's lots of debate about this and whether these Neolithic burials or burials around that period are intentional or not. Are we reading something into what is a very, after all, basic set of remains? We can't really read around whether these were ritualized burials or not. So there's lots of kind of elements to debate right at the beginning, and I wanted to take it all the way up to the end. So this book, Prospect of Immortality by Robert Ettinger, I don't know if you know Ettinger's name, but he's the man who invented cryogenics in the 1960s. So his head is frozen in a small, very small, actually, plant in California, along with both of his wives, which I think is a really interesting kind of thing if they do solve how to bring them back. What's he going to do then? And that's the place where every year the Walt Disney family has to dissuade people that Walt Disney's head is there, because it isn't, but there's some persistent urban myth that it is. There are certainly lots of strange people in there, but not Walt Disney, it would seem. So across time, from beginning to the end, and then across space. This was the stuff that I became most interested in, I think, just because I didn't necessarily know lots of this material until I started. So I wanted to think about how there's a whole section about how rulers are buried, and largely unburied and removed and reburied and kind of taken around all kinds of places. So I'm sure some of you know the story of Eva Peron's 40-year meanderings as a corpse around the world. And then there's also, a whole batch of really interesting stories to be made about communist leaders who are buried, because there's just one family that buries all communist leaders. I don't know if you know this. So they did a miraculous job with Lenin, and they realized quite quickly if they didn't give Stalin the formula, then they wouldn't be killed. So they kept it very kind of quiet themselves. They did indeed embalm Stalin, and Stalin was next to Lenin for about 10 years before he was quietly buried. But they still do everyone, from Bulgarian communists to North Korean communists. And it's like a family curse. There's a fantastic memoir about the family that's been written. So this is also the Nito Memorial in Angola as well. I wanted to think about the largest cemeteries in the world, which are nearly all Shiite, because you bury yourself around the martyr in the Shiite tradition. So the largest cemetery in the world is Wadi al-Salam in Najaf, which completely dwarfs the necropolis, which is gigantic, 6 million bodies, I think. It completely dwarfs the tiny city next to it, so metropolis and necropolis together. And then I think I needed to address, as we all do in the room, I think, why the hell are you interested in this stuff? And that kind of gets you to one of the key elements of world tourism, which is dark tourism. This kind of tourism towards, whether you're going to visit concentration camps, whether you're going to the Taj Mahal, which is a tomb, whether you're going to Angkor Wat, which is a set of tombs. And one of the most bizarre and, to us, bizarre and elongated ritual of burial is in South Sulawesi, which is a tourist destination, has been for about 40 years, really strongly sold by the government, where the rituals go on for years and years and years. And after living with a body for a year after its death, there's a whole kind of major ritual, and you start to be placed in limestone cliffs all the way up the kind of this amazing cliff, and you get your own effigy looking down on the village as well. And this is an amazing sequence. You work your way up the cliff until you eventually end up in a kind of communal ossuary for the bones that remain. And this is it's a real kind of issue about why Western people might want to travel and watch that kind of stuff, because they do in their tens of thousands. And it's also why Tibet sky burials, if you know about that, where the bodies are laid out and the vultures come down, a very kind of serious, solemn ritual. But the Chinese authorities have to try and periodically control that because it's such a big tourist thing. So there's lots of elements we can go with there. So I wanted to go across space as well and think about the exoticism of the dead. Basically, I think burial is about narcissism of minor differences, which is this idea that actually we have a set of assumptions about how we bury and how we mourn. If they're even slightly different, we start to think that's a bit peculiar and get very kind of interested in it. So, you know, being a Northern European Protestant, what the hell are those weird Catholics doing down there with all of these bones, that sort of thing. As in here, so the crematorium of the Capuchins in Rome. So, yeah, I went across faiths. I tried to go across faiths and looking mainly at the Abrahamic religions. Got really interested in burial in Jerusalem, where nearly every historic grave has the claim of 3 different religions on it. So this might be the grave of a saint. It might be the grave of a Jewish kind of leader. It might be the grave of an Islamic kind of figure, all claiming the same kind of grave. That was a really interesting area. So I got very involved in that as well. There's a section on that. But I'm going to, as I say, talk very precisely and locally as a kind of invitation to you to do this sort of the same. So inevitably, lockdown. What do you do in lockdown? You decide to discover every single lost graveyard in your local area, because that's the kind of time it was. And, you know, when you're allowed out for an hour, I would say to my partner, want to go for a walk? Just say, only if it's not to yet another sodding burial pit. Well, okay, we'll change plans. So I live in London, just north of the Barbican. So here's the Barbican here, if you know this area. And this is Golden Lane, which is in the Doomsday Book, which is the street that our estate's on. And basically, if you go in a straight line from Charterhouse here, famous Charterhouse, which is I'll talk about in a minute, all the way to Bunhill Fields. Basically, this is a full-on necropolis, it turns out. And that every single bit of green you see there is a former graveyard. And it might not necessarily have any traces left of it, might not even have an announcement that that's what it is. But these are the spaces that became kind of burial grounds and have now been erased. So I got really interested in kind of tracking that. The most famous of these, the most obvious of these, I mean, Bunhill Fields is well known because this is the dissenting burial ground, just on the edges of the city. Very important that the city line here finishes about here. So what do you do with your Roman dead? You're not allowed to bury them in the city. Throw them over the walls as quickly as you can and bury them quite nearby. So there's a reason why there's a cluster here. Charterhouse is one of the famous ones, as is Bunhill Field. So here we have a dissenting ground, opened in the 1660s and closed in 1852. And it's a very rare survival of an inner London graveyard. Very beautiful place where William Blake is buried in 2 places, confusingly. I'll talk about that. And where Defoe is buried and Bunyan and so on. So that's a kind of lovely place to sit in the middle of a pandemic. And then here, Charterhouse Square, which some of you might know, this Priory of the Salvation was founded in 1348. In other words, the moment of the plague, the Black Plague. This was a gigantic burial pit, and they built a priory to pray for the souls of the dead, and it's still an amazing complex if you ever want to visit it. It has a former cloister where the offside rule was invented for football. And in front of it, this lovely square, except it is, of course, a giant burial pit. When they built the Elizabeth line, which runs underneath, they had to keep stopping because of all of the bodies they kept finding. Just on this side, there is a tiny little plaque that just says this is a former burial pit for people in the plague of 1348. And there is a message on TripAdvisor which just says, "Don't bother going to this burial pit. There isn't even a gift shop." So, if you go slightly further beyond Bunhill Fields, you get to Wesley's Chapel. So this is, again, a dissenting kind of ground and a famous area for Methodism and this kind of area. So just over the road from Bunhill Fields, you begin to get the famous graves in next door to Wesley's house and the foundation of this kind of whole Methodist religion. This is kind of fine. This looks fairly organised, doesn't it? It gets very, very weird around the back, though. And if you walk around to behind the church, the chapel, there are still graves there, but they have tennis tables in. And also, this feels very tasteless, doesn't it? Barbecue. There's a bike rack in a grave, and you can see that they've kind of raised the roof of the city block that they've built above these graves, which are kind of left isolated in this weird sort of area. And that's all because, of course, they're trying to preserve the monument to John Wesley himself, which is at the back of the church rather than at the front. So all of that stuff is raised up. But this is the typical way that we live with the dead, I think, is that you kind of keep stumbling across these very odd, peculiar sort of survivals. And that's what got me really interested. As I turn around, walk home, you walk through the Quaker fields. So these are the specific dissenting grounds for Quakers. So obviously a connection here to York. And most of the graveyards here, graves and gravestones have gone. There is a little monument that sort of tells you that this was the Society of Friends burial ground, 1661 to 1852. There's that date again, 1852. And there is a tiny, very moving monument to George Fox, one of the founders of the Society of Friends. So, and that's kind of hanging on. It's just about hanging on, but is kind of quite degraded as a space. Not as much as elsewhere, though. So walk a little bit further and you're at St. Luke's Church, one of the Hawksmoor churches, which is in a fairly dilapidated state. This church was a ruin from the war, in fact, for about 40 years before it was finally put together again in the 1990s, and is now the home of the LSO. It's, you can see that some of the chest tombs are in a very kind of poor state. And then just nailed quietly to the fitness centre at the other end of the park, which is of course the graveyard, City Pest House, built here in open fields, 1593, used during the Great Plague, 1665, demolished 1736. So no trace of that at all. So there we go, another burial pit to look at. On my street, so Golden Lane, there is a life-saving park, tiny little pocket park, which is, of course, inevitably a graveyard, and quite a moving one, actually. It was a pauper burial ground for an area of just outside the city walls called Sligo, because it was entirely full of Irish immigrants who couldn't afford to do anything other than be buried in very large open pits, usually 12 coffins deep. And it's now no trace, not a single trace or announcement that that's what it was. It's just a nice little park with a nice open hut for coffee, which unfortunately I had to tell my baristas was exactly where the watch house was, and that 20 years before they discovered 10,000 extra bones underneath exactly where they were serving, which didn't make Liam very happy. But they have done lots of excavations here, and the great thing about London archaeology anyway, and I'm sure the same in York, you do get these really detailed accounts of the excavations that take place through the Museum of London. But the other thing that really struck me is there's an idea of genius loci, the idea that something recurs in the same place over and over again. Up till 1940, on this entrance into Fortune Street Park was where the City of London's Coroner's Court was, which is where all of the drowned of the Thames were kind of kept and viewed and investigated to see if there was foul play. And that was bombed completely in 1940. The other really weird detail is Golden Lane was the street on which Alfred Hitchcock used to stop, having done a day's work in the Goman Studios up the road, to have a drink and think morbid, nasty thoughts. So there's kind of a lot kind of going on in this sort of space. And, you know, the layers of it are amazing. I did get increasingly kind of moved, though, not by necessarily those stories, but just by the spaces that indicate nothing, not even a park, just a small scrub of land. That was Thomas's burying ground. That's another coffee shop that I spend most of my life in. It doesn't announce itself at all. It's just you have to kind of do the historical work to kind of find out where these places are located. And it's just these sort of traceless elements that I think are really interesting. Final morbid slide would be walking just a few more minutes. You get to Seward Street, lovely, nice playground for the under fives, very lovely. Indication 5 feet higher than the street itself. And that is where the unclaimed bodies of paupers from Bartholomew's Hospital, just down the road, were buried. And you know that they're higher because you just lay the bodies, put lime on them, a little layer of dirt, and then start to layer it up again. So you get higher and higher as you go. And then literally 50 yards away is the car park of death. And that is the Mount Mills burial pit, which is mentioned and discussed by Defoe in the Diary of a Plague Year, which of course everyone was reading in 2020 and 2021. But he talks about that kind of space. So there you go. So this was just in a kind of small area. And I know it's an unusual concentration, and there are reasons for that. But I think, you know, cities as old, say, as York, you can do exactly the same sort of thing, I think. Okay, so just in the last bit, I'm going to talk about the reasons why I can journey even to just those green patches and sort of think about why they're still there, even if they're not graveyards, and who was responsible for that. And it's a story of two people from the 19th century. The first is the amazing Isabella Holmes, and I'm going to talk about Graveyard Walker, as he was called as well, the campaigner from earlier on in the century. So going backwards, really, Isabella Holmes was a completely amazing reformist, feminist kind of thinker in the late 19th century. And she wrote this book, The London Burial Grounds, simply by walking absolutely everywhere through London and counting them and trying to break into kind of areas that had been turned into goods yards or whatever. And she did this in 5 months or so in 1894. She'd been asked to do a catalogue, in a sense, a gazetteer of all of the available burial grounds that still existed or that were on maps and have now been lost. And this was part of her role as the Metropolitan Public Gardens Association kind of secretary, and she worked very hard with them. And the idea was, they got this done in 1884, was that any prior burial ground could not be built on anymore and would become a park. And that's the kind of law that she helped get together. And I love her description of how she got through all of these kind of grounds that basically had been privatised or built over. An appearance of utter insignificance and an air of knowing where you're going and what you want is a passport for all parts of London, which is still true. You can get anywhere you want, really. So Isabella Holmes was one of the people who preserved these parks, and this is the reason that they're kind of there. And she presents quite a lot of useful kind of advice and stories about this. I mean, the worst offenders are the Church of England, who will sell any land immediately to kind of get rid of it. So what survives tend to be the dissenting grounds. So things like Bunner Hill. There is Blake's second grave. There is another gravestone which they realised was in the wrong place, and that he'd actually been buried in a pit with 16 other people. So there's that. There's also religions that have a different relationship to cemeteries and their preservation or not. So, you know, Jewish cemeteries can be closed, and these have been closed in the East End, but there is the responsibility of the synagogue to maintain and respect those places, even if there's no longer burials in them. And these are really incredibly haunting. If you walk through the East End of London, you can quite often just glimpse through metal grills, just a sort of sense of an absolute oasis of graves that have been left untouched for a really long period of time. So you know, that kind of helps. The other thing that helps is to make up stories about your graveyard. in order to really annoy developers. So some of you might know the story of the Crossbones graveyard, which is in Southwark, so underneath the kind of, this horrific shard that stands there. This is supposedly the graveyard of the Southwark geese, i.e. the prostitutes that served most of the bishopric of Southwark and couldn't be buried in consecrated ground, so there's kind of a shifty sort of place where they were buried. Some of that is a little bit mythicized because I think there was a guy in about 1972 who dropped quite a lot of acid and had a vision that he should, kind of preserve this sort of space as you do on acid. And it became a real kind of focus for community campaigning, and it has this amazing fence rather, that kind of goes all the way down the street, which is full of memorials to outsiders, to dissidents, to migrants, to prostitutes, to people who died of HIV, etc. So it's an extraordinary local kind of space, and it's owned by Network Rail, who try to sell it roughly every 2 years. And there's another kind of effusion of enthusiasm to kind of preserve it. So getting a kind of team behind you helps. So lots of cemeteries now have friends, and they have been crucial in keeping Victorian graveyards alive. The other quick thing just to maybe begin to finish on is to talk about George Alfred Walker. So you can see his dates, 1807 to 1884. He was Quaker adjacent, I think I'd like to say, rather than Quaker, in that he had lots of, he was involved with the Society of Friends, but also was mentored by them, and he went to medical school, became a doctor for the most notorious slum in London at the time, which is this area around St Clement Danes. So in order to orient you, there is the start of Fleet Street. That's the Strand. So it's this kind of border moment. If you've been to the Royal Courts of Justice, hopefully just as a tourist, they're now built here, but they're built on quite a lot of gruesome graveyards, it turns out. And St Clement's Church is famously is kind of isolated, or has been isolated for a long time, in the middle of the Strand. It's now been rescued by King's College a little bit. So that was his kind of patch. He had a medical service from Drury Lane, but this was the area that he walked through again and again and again. And he was appalled at the state of this slum for all kinds of reasons, but not least because the living and the dead were entirely kind of hurled together. It was where quite a lot of abattoirs were for the City of London. It had graveyards kind of thrown up, pauper graveyards, Church of England overspills. St Clement's Danes Church famously was entirely stuffed with dead bodies, and then it started buying up plots of land all over the place in this kind of area. And for an early 19th century doctor, he had a miasmatic theory of disease, which means that miasma in the air, bad air, literally malaria, causes illness. So if you are living with the dead, then the dead themselves are kind of claiming the living. They're beginning to kind of drag all of these paupers with them. So this was a whole kind of world of the undead for him in many ways. And he was particularly kind of fascinated by a very unhappy street, Stanhope Street, which had abattoirs, 3 graveyards, lots of slum buildings, all this horrific kind of space. This was also known as a quite a radical bolshe, as we would say, area, which kind of was almost a no-go zone for those forerunners of the police, and that it was a area that refused to pay its taxes and did all kinds of resistant things. Ironic being that all of the law courts are here, and they're just abutting onto it in quite interesting ways. So that was his patch, and he determined that he was going to campaign as much as he could to try and clear the spaces of these utterly choked terrains. So he wrote this great, very snappy phrase, gatherings from graveyards, particularly those of London, and it's his kind of denunciation, a Jeremiad of how disgusting the kind of state of graveyards were. And his most famous case, which absolutely horrified all of London, was Enon Chapel. And this is one of the most famous engravings, I think, from the early 19th century. That's people having a dancing class in Enon Chapel on a wooden floorboard. That's all there was, a wooden floorboard, underneath which were 12,000 bodies, just thrown in rather than in coffins necessarily. Absolutely appalling. So this kind of sense of just the juxtaposition. And he describes in great loving detail Sunday schools where all of these corpse flies would come up through the floorboards, and these lovely, pretty, innocent children were being kind of slowly pulled down into the dead. And he was a good salesman for his kind of campaign, because George Walker bought this whole chapel and determined that he was going to bury these people with respect. But before he did that, he opened this as a tourist attraction. Like, isn't this terrible? Would you like to see some more? That kind of, expose logic that we're so used to. So that was his famous kind of campaign. Where he was coming from was from burial reform people amongst the utilitarians. So these are the big reformers of the early 19th century, all of whom had the famous Jeremy Bentham as their kind of philosopher, their intellectual guide. And some of you may know you can still see his corpse, which is sitting in UCL. The head is wax, but that's because largely the students from King's College kept stealing his real head, taking it down the road. So King's College students would have to, UCL students would have to steal it back. But he's there. You can see it from the street as well now, which is very nice. It used to be that his head had to be in Senate, I think, for it to be quorate, and that's no longer the case. So he was someone who did that to himself, because he said even the dead have a use, they have a utility. And so when he died, he was publicly dissected by his friend, a Dr. Smith, and displayed for 40 or 50 years in various states of disassembly before they put him back together, and he's now sitting there proudly in UCL. And one of his secretaries, Edward Chadwick, became a sanitary reformer, particularly powerful figure in civil service and government reforms in the early part of the 19th century. So with George Walker and his campaign in the press, they eventually got a select committee together to talk about all of the kind of issues relating to the interment of bodies in towns. Chadwick wrote a supplementary report, which is even more gruesome and nasty, in 1843. But it was still the case they couldn't quite push reform through for another 10 years until you get the Burial Acts in 1850, 52 and 53, which are the ones that, in a sense, shut down inner city churchyards. So you can no longer bury, except under certain circumstances, you can no longer bury in cities. And that's the beginning of the whole kind of emergence of cemeteries being moved out of centres of cities and to the peripheries, so that this whole kind of hygienic idea is emerging. I could talk to you about why Waterloo Bridge is built on the dead, but I won't. I don't have enough time. I'll just go to his last case. I can talk about that if you like. George Walker's last case, another place that I went to in lockdown quite a lot. Lovely spa fields, gardens. Worryingly rolling floor though, slightly worrying. And that's because it was one of the most notorious burial grounds in London in the 1840s. It had a watch house in the centre, which caught fire in 1845. And then all of the bodies around it caught fire. So there was a corpse fire that went on for a whole week, which had a huge pall of the dead over London. And that's one of the issues that George Walker was really pushing for. So he released these pamphlets: Burial Ground Incendiarism, The Last Fire at the Bone House in the Spa Fields, Golgotha. He's really good at this rhetoric. Or The Minute Anatomy of Grave Digging in London. So that kind of sense of those sorts of scandals happening over and over again was what pushed burial reform. One of the ways it went was because of the helpful example of Paris. Central Paris used to bury everyone in the cemetery of the Church of the Innocents. And it was estimated 10 million bodies in it. Unfortunately, in 1780, there was a week of rain and the cemetery burst. it got so sodden that the dead were washed all the way through the kind of streets of Paris. And that caused a few problems. So there was a whole kind of reform campaign that happened a generation before. Part of that was building the catacombs in Paris, still the most popular tourist attraction, with these endless kind of little alleyways underground of the dead, but also the founding of Père-Lachaise Cemetery, which is the model garden cemetery for everywhere else. So that's why it arrives in the UK, first in Glasgow, in Liverpool, but then also famously in London. So you get the Magnificent Seven, built 1833 to 41. That's before the Burial Acts, but the middle classes are beginning to move out of these really choked graveyards and looking for Gothic spaces to bury themselves in. And so, that's a really kind of key moment as well in this history. I'm supposed to be a literature person, so here we go. Walker's imprint you can see everywhere in literature, but particularly look at the dates here of Bleak House, 1852, the year of one of the key burial acts. One of the key plot elements of that is that Lady Dedlock's secret lover is buried in a Drury Lane pauper's graveyard. She dies at the gates of the graveyard. And George Walker's medical practice was kind of about here, and that's the one we reckon was the burial ground on Drury Lane that features that Dickens talks about in his novel. So you can kind of see this stuff everywhere. So it's really that phase that begins to both preserve the spaces of graveyards, but also push this new idea of a hygienic set of burials. And that's it. I'm going to stop there because I wanted to leave space for questions. Just to say that, so this book, Graveyards, does a lot of that work in a steadier pace through the work, and has loads and loads of illustrations. So all of the illustrations I've used today are kind of in the book as well. And then that sort of followed on from this book on the Gothic, which is also a kind of visual history of that. So they pair together. And if you want to investigate the whole mythology around whether Dracula features Highgate Cemetery or not, big debate, then I did an edition which kind of covers quite a lot of that stuff a few years ago. So there's a whole sequence of things you can kind of get interested in. But you can also come and talk to me, and we should have some questions. But thanks for your attention.
And I think I really just want to underline that Roger's just covered such a small part of an incredibly rich text, and I would urge you, just go and lick it. It's lovely. It's absolutely wonderful text, so go and have a look at it downstairs. And I think Roger will be staying later to be signing copies. Yeah. But at this stage, I think I'd love to open it up for any questions at this stage. Please don't ask your question until you're with the microphone. So can we start with this lady here and then... Oh, this one first, and then, in order. Thank you.
Hi, mine is sort of a two-part question.
Okay, just raise your voice at the end. You'll be fine.
Yeah. There seems to be kind of a lot of care and value attached to our treatment of the physical bodies of the dead, and almost an expectation of respect for them. Do you have any thoughts on kind of why we attach such sentiment to what is sort of just the physical remains of people? And then the second part is kind of, have you encountered any cultures where this isn't the case, where there's not kind of this sort of the disposal of dead is kind of just the practicalities of not having kind of the for considered disease and stuff?
Okay, thank you. A couple of really small questions there. I mean, we do say that, so we have respect for the dead, but I think if you read any of the documents from the select committees in the 19th century, I mean, people are literally jumping up and down on bodies to try and get them lower into the ground. And, what can we do with this graveyard that's very, very near the Thames? Well, we are building a new bridge. We can just take all of the bones and put them on as foundations underneath. Even if they were buried like a month ago, they were being carried along. So we don't have that much respect for the dead necessarily, always. We like to think we do. And I think, that idea of death a leveler is totally wrong. It's always to do with, massive inequalities about how bodies are dealt with. But it does seem to be that this idea of intentional deposition, so depositing bodies in particular places for a particular set of reasons, does start very early. And does seem to kind of come together with lots of kind of rituals and explorations of deference to who you descend from, but it's incredibly difficult to interpret that. It's because all you've got is physical remains. I mean, one of the famous stories, which I didn't know until I did this research, was about Neanderthals and the discovery of Neanderthals in the 19th century and the naming of Neanderthal bodies. In the 1950s, there was a guy called Ralph Serecki who was researching Neanderthal graves, and he came across, they had this brand new technology, which is they could detect pollen. And he discovered like 9 or 10 different types of pollen in the grave, at which point he said they buried them with flowers. Well, clearly they buried them with flowers. And he wrote a book which was called The First Flower People in the 1960s. Because that was it. So maybe it tells you something about how dark the world has got now. They were the first flower people in the 1960s. What they've discovered now and realised is that pollen was there from the rats' feces that ate the corpses. So it's not a set of flowers at all. So it's like we reflect, we project really strongly onto graves what we want them to be. But that can also mean, and that culture are really cruel or indifferent, and that means they're not human in some kind of way. So all of the Jesuits who went to colonize Canada, as it now is, were absolutely obsessed and appalled with the rituals of burial and disinterment and reinterment of bodies in the Native American population. They're very, very kind of upset by all of that. I do find it ironic that the key Jesuit father who wrote all of this detail, endless detail about how horrible and fetishistic this kind of stuff was, you can go and see his skull because they discovered it recently and they put it on display as a relic in Canada. What? So there are different kinds of theories about that, but clearly we do have a lot of kind of awe and dread about that fundamental rupture. But there's just infinite ways of dealing with that, I think, across cultures.
Right, thank you. And this question here, thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. I guess I've got a logistical question for you, which is kind of related to what we were just talking about. So you've walked around your local area, and you've got these places that used to be burial grounds and no longer are. Are the bodies still there? And how often are there removals of bodies generally in these sorts of situations, or are they just left there? What dictates whether a place keeps the bodies or is
a really good question. We were talking about this earlier, weren't we, Julie? About what's happening under the ground is quite often quite interesting. Well, in the case of building in the area that I live in, so right on the edges of the city, I mentioned that Charterhouse Square they were digging the Elizabeth Tunnel, and they had to stop. Because they did find all of these kind of graves and all the bones rather, and they did stop and have to kind of do a whole archaeological survey of that, which was really interesting and controversial at the time because it revealed medieval London was way more diverse than any right-winger would like. So there were kind of issues around that. And there is a kind of store in London which has, I think, 17,000 remains, doesn't it, I think, which is a kind of central store. And sometimes bodies are, or remains are now moved quite carefully, quite respectfully, I think much more than used to be the case. It's become a kind of a great concern, and as you know, museums are going through this whole kind of ethical writhing about whether to display human remains or not, and that's a really kind of live issue here and elsewhere. So the bodies are often moved, I think. So I think they moved them all out of Fortune Street, for example, and then reburied them on the peripheries of London, which is exactly what George Walker was doing. So let me move all of these bodies to Norwood, once I've got enough money out of them to continue my campaign. So, respect, not respect.
A question over here, if you don't mind. Thank you.
So I'm one of these morbid goths that likes to go
Excellent.
around looking
Welcome.
at graveyards and blasting The Cure in my headphones when I'm doing so. And something that I have noticed that seems to be, I personally think is a bit of a problem, is you can track along the years at gravestones, they just start to look ugly. Is the easiest way to say
Right.
it. You go from these like beautiful, gorgeous stones with intricate details that will tell you so much about the person buried there, to today that you just have like a bit of like black stone with someone's name on and maybe like rest in peace grandma, but nothing else really.
Sure.
I was just wondering, have you noticed anything in your research that may have indicated why that's happened, why we've suddenly gone from these really gorgeous portrayals of someone's life to, this may be really horrible to say, but something that's incredibly tacky looking?
Sure,
Yeah.
Yeah, well, of course, it's taste, so therefore it's very subjective. And I'm sure that, as you wander around somewhere like Highgate, you can kind of look at things and thought, wow, that was probably really brash for its time, or really provoking. And on the other hand, you might have a set of standard kind of images or representations, the broken column or the angel and so on, very familiar. But then you have these weird kind of moments of neo-pharaonic or Egyptian architecture that you get kind of popping up here and there, particularly after 1802 and all of that spoil coming from Egypt. We stole it off Napoleon, didn't we, and brought it back here. And there was a huge kind of eruption of that kind of taste, both in architecture but also in grave kind of styles. And then you get a kind of whole sequence of that, Mayan kind of style, much more representational kind of styles that kind of emerge. And I think, recently you see a lot more photographs on gravestones themselves, and that is kind of borrowed from Southern Europe, I think, where you see that much more commonly. And I think, uptight Protestant Northerners felt this was slightly kind of over the top, probably. But it's something that's been adopted. Full-scale, life-size statues of the person who's died. I saw quite a lot of that in Barcelona when I was walking through graveyards there. A very good goth grave there that everyone goes to see, the Kiss of Death, which is this huge skeleton that's just sweeping up someone and kissing them to death. Marvellous. So it's taste. There's lots of different kinds of taste, I think. And it's quite interesting to see people wrestling with taste. So, the Quaker say or Jewish tradition is that, no representation. That's not kind of, it's not done. But you can kind of push the edges of that. And particularly if there are important kind of Jewish leaders in the community, they do get a little bit more of an allowance of, say, a bust of someone you see, but very, very rarely. So it's tradition and expectation, but also pushing the bounds. But ultimately, it's about taste, I think, and that changes all the time.
And money also.
And money, yeah. Obviously, it's all about money. Yeah, very expensive to be buried in Highgate these days.
Could we have a question here and then a question here? Thank you very much.
This is much briefer. I think, given all the controversies and health problems and all sorts that human remains can bring, I think we could follow the example. I mean, in India, which is a much older culture than us, it's an endorsement. The solution is to cremate everybody, really.
Yeah, sure. I mean, except. This was the most striking thing about it. So I've got a section on Buddhism and Hinduism, which are very much introductions to this kind of world. But the thing that most surprised me about Buddhism is how completely obsessed they are with the physical body. And that's quite surprising. But even when the Buddha died, 4 princes were supposed to come to the funeral, so they divided the body in 4. But unfortunately, 8 princes came to the funeral. So they divided the body in 8 and they took them away. One of those princes was very much an evangelist for this kind of movement. So it's claimed that there are 64,000 pieces of the actual Buddha that are kind of spread around, and that's where you get the kind of the most important stupas, the kind of burial sites. But any kind of particularly holy Buddhist priest, it is dried and propped up in a temple. You can see them all over the place. So very, very much involved in, if you're holy enough, you don't use the cremation kind of model, but actually you preserve the body in a different kind of way. This is not to say that it didn't profoundly upset colonialists arriving in that part of the world, very kind of distressed by cremation. Cremation was illegal in Britain until 1884, and there was a famous test case of a slightly strange Welshman who claimed to be a druid and tried to cremate his own son and was promptly prosecuted for desecration of a body. But the courts found that so absurd that they legalised cremation, and then it's kind of taken off ever since then. But it's a crucial kind of taste moment there, I think, about shifting attitudes around that. So the largest percentage of burials are now cremations, and it's ashes rather than anything else. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
Roger, that was great. I am a professional hunter of the dead.
Okay.
And I'm forever amazed how many people come to me from all over the world wanting to find the final resting place of their ancestor.
Sure.
So it's really important. So I spend a lot of my time in a cemetery, especially in and around York here. And I'm struck by, initially you get that 5 or 10 years after somebody has died, perhaps a burial or the ashes have been cremated, and you have that pilgrimage by the grave.
Sure.
And then suddenly after that there's this tailing off.
Sure.
And we know that many headstones in and around our parish churches in York have been removed and laid flat, are used as paving stones. If you could kind of go forward in time as a time traveller, maybe 200 years from now, how could you see these gardens of the dead, these burial grounds kind of surviving?
Yeah, it is a really good question, isn't it? And I think there are profound shifts going on right now about those sorts of things. So all kinds of things you can do with cremated ashes. You can have them concentrated down into diamonds and wear them around your neck. You can have them fired into space. Although Scotty from Star Trek was on one of Elon Musk's missions that blew up, so he didn't make it to space, unfortunately. But that's an option. You can go into low Earth orbit if you want. All of the kind of natural burial stuff which has come through from the 1990s, being buried as a tree, kind of in the bowl of a tree, so you kind of feed the cycle and so on. And there seems to be that we're in a kind of place where, certainly in our culture anyway, 40% of deaths don't have funerals attached anymore. So people don't necessarily want to kind of memorialise or can't afford to memorialise or, whatever issues. And that sort of sense of the spirit, kind of the metaphor of the spirit kind of going up into the air, so cremation, seems to be very strong for us now, in a kind of way that precisely you should not leave a trace. So that was kind of natural burial kind of idea. And that's very much where we are, I think. So the answer would be that there aren't those kind of traces. It might well be that you just have kind of parks of memorial or commemoration that aren't necessarily marked out in that kind of way. You might have other documentation, but So I was quite struck by that whole kind of shift, actually.
Well, on that cheery note. Thanks again. So thank you very much, Roger.
Thanks, Julie.